The dematerializing of our lives is, I think, another area where we could make a significant conscious contribution to at least pumping the brakes on the approach toward the passing of a fail-safe point. And that means exploring such admittedly odious possibilities as virtual reality, where light replaces matter and code replaces computer codes and this sort of thing replace the manipulation of matter by the kinds of crude technologies that we have grown accustomed to. I can imagine a world where we commit ourselves not to something like Star Wars, but if the technical mentality must have a bone to chew on, then let's set a global or national technical goal of producing, by the year 2005, say, a technology which results in something which looks like black contact lenses. Contact lenses which are installed in the eyelid such that when you close your eyes, menus hang in space. The entire culture could be dematerialized and downloaded into an electronic virtual culture that would nowhere come tangential to the earth and require very limited resource extraction. If this mattered as much as being able to knock down 700 incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles in a minute and a half, you can bet your boots it would be on your plate by breakfast time. It is within reach. It's simply that we are not organizing ourselves to save ourselves. We are organizing ourselves to deny our dilemma and to continue the fiction of business as usual. And the only catalyst that I personally, in a lifetime of experience, have encountered that can change us quickly enough to set us moving in these new directions is the psychedelic experience. If hortatory preaching could do it, then I would think the Deer Park sermon at Sarnath or the Sermon on the Mount would have been the turning point. And obviously those were just speed bumps on the way to the apocalypse. So what is necessary, you see, is to address the organism, to address experience. And the way it is done is by dissolving boundaries. Because the reason we are able to sit here tonight without freaking out completely about the situation that we're in is because we have incredible barriers against a full assimilation of the information that is available to us right now. I mean, the fact that we can maintain our sanguinity and look at something like the AIDS epidemic means that we are emotionally numb to threats to our very existence. I mean, the African continent is truly in danger of becoming an empty continent through disease. I don't want to see an empty tropical world inherited by re-empowered honky men 50 years in the future. I think that would be an obscene denouement to the AIDS situation. These sorts of things are intolerable. We have the technological ability, the financial punch, even at this late date in the mismanaged Republican game, to change the world. What we seem to lack is the means, the ability, the chutzpah, whatever it is, to change our minds. We must change our minds, each and every one of us. This election, they're screaming, change, change. And when you look at the minuscule differences that you're offered, and people say, my God, you're not going to knock Clinton too, are you? No, I'm for minuscule change in the absence of any other possibility. but only because I think it will make it easier for us to do the larger business of radically transforming society. Well, so that's all sort of nuts and bolts stuff. And I wanted to sort of talk about that for a while, and then I wanted to change my focus, because above and beyond the practical things that we can do collectively and individually, I think we also have to seriously rethink our first principles. And that leads me in a more philosophical and theoretical direction. I can't fail to talk to you about the conclusions that I draw from the psychedelic experience, because that's been the major influence on my thinking. When I first began experimenting with these shamanic plants, I assumed that the available models would suffice for understanding what was going on. The first available model was, you are perturbing brain chemistry, and so you are essentially mixing up the test pattern. That theory could be dispensed with about 30 minutes into the first experience, because these experiences are not chaotic in the old sense. They are coherent, architectonic, transformative. They are not the antithesis, but the quintessence of meaning. Meaning is enhanced, not obliterated. So then I moved on to a kind of Freudian expectation. These psychedelic plants and compounds must be a kind of instant psychotherapy, a catalyst for the study of personal neurosis, a tool for the recovery of traumatic memory, so forth and so on. All true, but woefully inadequate to the totality of the experience, much of which seems to lie far outside the parameters of some notion as cheerful as instant psychotherapy. Okay, so then jack the metaphor slightly higher. It must be then that it was not Freud but Jung who was right. And so it must be that this is an insight into not only my personality, my past, my trauma, but a collectivity of myth, of expectation that is written into the mammalian and primate genes that we carry in our bodies, and that these vast forms glimpsed in the psychedelic dimension are in fact the archetypes of Jung. They are the overstructure of the mass psyche that arises out of our physical and mental organization, and around which language crystallizes various cultural interpretations in which we then take up residence and cheerfully and unthinkingly live out our lives. Well, turns out that also is completely, while true, inadequate to the sum total of the experience. So in the past few years, and probably because I have been associating with mathematicians and people like Ralph Abraham and Rupert Sheldrake a bit, I've come to what I call the geometric model of the psychedelic experience. And I certainly don't represent it as the end of the intellectual road, but it is a provisional model that is the best I can do at the moment. I think that, and it seems logically compelling to me, that consciousness as ordinarily experienced is a human ability shaped by evolutionary pressure. And since evolutionary threat and harm usually comes at us in three-dimensional space, this is where consciousness has been forced, really, to concentrate and define itself. Now, least I'm not making myself clear, let me restate it. Because of the possibility of being stepped on by woolly mammoths and eaten by saber-toothed tigers, the primitive evolving mind of human beings concentrated on nearby space and time, because that's where threat comes from, the kind of threat that has to be immediately responded to by running away or fighting or something like that. But consciousness, if the psychedelics prove anything, they prove that consciousness is an incredibly plastic and malleable medium. And so what happens when you take a compound like psilocybin in silent darkness, in a situation of no threat and low anxiety and low input from the exterior world, is that this function, which is essentially in most situations a closed fist ready to strike out at something coming from nearby, unfolds into something much more beautiful, much more interesting, and much more true to itself. In other words, not defined by an exterior context or situation, but defined by its own mechanics. And when this happens, what we see is, a number of things, or one thing potentially describable in a number of different ways. What we see is that time and becoming is not entirely driven by the consequences of the past. This is the philosophy which reigns in the world of three-dimensional space. But in higher dimensional modalities, it is possible to contact something which I sometimes call the great attractor, sometimes the transcendental object at the end of time, and sometimes the big surprise. In other words, one can discover within oneself something that is not pushing us from behind into a frightening and unknowable future, but something which is actually calling to us from the future and casting a waving and flickering shadow down into the lower dimensional slice of ordinary reality. Now, people such as ourselves largely have been phobic of this concept because it's been under the control of beady-eyed little priests for centuries and centuries, and they have used it as an argument for a laundry list of moral do's and don'ts, which is a complete perversion of what it is. What it is the attractor, or the omega point, or the transcendental object at the end of time. It is the lost portion of ourselves. It's the portion of ourselves that we left behind when we made the descent into matter and physicality, that being a thing made of meat and bone and nerve entails. And most people, at least in these secular high-tech democracies, have so lost touch with this that they never lay eyes on it again until they close their eyes for the last time. The one thing that we have all imbibed too deeply is the secular belief that death is nothingness. We are left to fall back on the schemes of the secular politicians and the managers. And these are the least worthy among us to lead us anywhere. Culture is a kind of diversion, a kind of entertainment that takes us away from the real business of being.